In this video, we will have a look at the callable type hint for our argument. At php.net, inside of the search field, if we simply type types and hit enter, this will take us to the types section, and if we scroll down a little bit, we want to use this callbacks / callables. If we click on this one, and it says that callbacks can be denoted by callable type hint as of PHP 5.4, which is what I explained earlier. Then we have some functions like call user func, which is the one we are going to be using during this lesson, or usort accept user-defined callback functions as parameter. Callback functions can not only be simple functions, but also object methods, including static class methods. Static class methods and object methods, all this is for the object-oriented PHP, which we are not covering within this course because this is just a beginner's course, obviously. We will talk about this in the future series. Then we go for the passing, and a PHP function is passed by its name as a string, and a built-in or user-defined function can be used except language constructs such as array, echo, empty, and so on. A method of an instantiated object, we actually can ignore this one because we're not going to be using this again because it's object-oriented related. So we can actually scroll down. Apart from common user-defined functions, anonymous functions, which as we know are also called closures, can also be passed to the callback parameter. Let's open our editor and have a look at a few examples. So if we create a new function called multiply by 10 return callback, for instance, function, and then multiply by 10 return callback. And as arguments, the first one will be number. By default, we'll set it to 0. And then we have callable type hinting for our second argument, which we'll simply call callback. And then obviously set of curly brackets, and we're going to start with a number. We are multiplying it by 10, so star symbol, equal, and then 10. Just to remind you, obviously, we've been covering this already. Using this approach, this syntax, basically what we're doing, we are multiplying the number associated with the same variable to which we are assigning this whole expression, and multiplying it by basically number following after this basically multiplies equal symbol. So we are multiplying the number which we pass through as an argument times 10. And then we simply return function called call underscore user func. And then we go for this callback function which we want to execute, and any arguments that we want to pass to this callback function separated by comma. We're only going to be passing one, which is this number. Let's quickly have a look at the documentation for this call user func on php.net. So if we go back to our browser and let's quickly paste it in our search field, and there we go, call the callback given by the first parameter. And it takes two arguments, basically two. It takes one mandatory argument, which is the name of the function, and then you have obviously between the square brackets number of optional parameters. Calls the callback given by the first parameter and passes the remaining parameters as argument to this function. So that's pretty much what it does. So if we go back to our editor, so now that we have the function defined, what we want to do is to call it. So what we're going to do is echo, simply echo it, multiply by 10 return callback. And what I want to do, I'm going to multiply number 4 by 10 times 10. And for the callback, I'm simply going to put in an anonymous function, basically a closure. So function, in between the brackets, I'm going to put this number argument, which as you can see here, we are passing this. The second argument of this call user func is basically the first argument of the function which we are calling. If we had more, then obviously it would be, let's say, argument 2. And then obviously we would have it here. You don't have to call them the same way, so you can call them whichever way you want. You can have an argument 5, for instance, and here argument 2, and they basically going to correspond. It's just basically the number of arguments in the order in which they are passed to both of these functions. So we have function, then set of curly brackets, and semicolon after this. So basically what's going to happen when we call this function, we pass in the number, and then callback will be called right after this multiplication here, and returned whatever basically is inside of this closure function here. And what I'm going to do is simply return, and let's say the number is, and I'm just going to pass this number variable. So we'll see basically whatever the return value has been basically generated by this function. So if we now save it and preview it in a browser, we go to our php course.dev, refresh the page, and there we go, the number is 40. 4 times 10 is 40. And obviously once we've multiplied this, we call this anonymous function, which have returned this string, obviously with the calculation which the result of this calculation which we passed as an argument here. So once again, callable is anything that can be called, something like function, like classes, which you haven't basically covered within this course, as I've explained on several occasions already. So they can be functions, anonymous, whether they are anonymous or they are named functions, or objects and methods basically on these objects. But obviously in our case we only have anonymous functions, which we've covered obviously within this course, plus obviously the named function. So let's have a look at the name function example as well. So what I'm going to do above this call here to this function which we've obviously defined above, what I'm going to do is create a new function callable function, and I'm going to give it this argument number, and then inside of this one I'm going to do something like, I'm just going to basically cut and paste this inside of this function. Now rather than passing the anonymous function as I did here, I can remove all this, and what I'm going to do is simply pass the string which is corresponding to the name of the function. So I'm just going to copy the name of this function and paste it as a string as a second argument to this multiply by 10 return callback function. And what's going to happen now is basically this function will look for the callable, anything callable. Obviously we are only passing the string which would represent this function, so it's going to find out that obviously we're trying to call this function which is defined above, and it's going to simply execute it using this call user func when it's obviously all these calculations have been done and it's ready to basically call it. So if we save it and preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and as you can see the result is exactly the same. So you can either pass the anonymous function, basically the closure, in other words, as a second argument straight onto this call, or you can simply create a named function and then pass its name as a string as the second callable argument to this function above. Another way to tell the function that its argument is expecting the anonymous function is to use the closure class type hinting. This one, however, works only with anonymous function. It doesn't work with the named functions. First of all, before we start changing this example here, let's go to PHP documentation and have a look at the closure. First of all, so if we type in closure inside of the search, hit enter, this will take us to the closure class, and in the introduction we'll read that it's basically class used to represent anonymous functions. Anonymous functions implemented in PHP 5.3 yield objects of this type. This fact used to be considered an implementation detail, but it can now be relied upon. Starting with PHP 5.4, this class has methods that allow further control of the anonymous function after it has been created. We're not worried about this, that's object-oriented. So let's go back to our editor and let's quickly have a look at how we can change our example to use the closure. So rather than callable, now we are going to type hint it with a closure class. So now we have a closure type of this callback argument. What needs to happen, basically nothing else needs to be changed inside of the function itself, but what's going to happen if we call this example with the named function? If we save it and preview it in a browser, if we go back to php.dev, refresh the page, and there we go, we have catchable fatal error argument to pass to multiply by 10 return callback must be an instance of closure string given. So as you can see, we cannot pass named functions into the as this closure type of the argument. So what we would have to do instead is basically go back to our anonymous function. So function, pass this number argument and use it this way if we now copy and paste this inside of this function. This one will simply be ignored. It's defined, but obviously it's not called anyway, so we don't have to remove it for now. If we save it, refresh the page, and everything works fine now. As you can see, it only works with the anonymous function which doesn't have any name. And what we could also do, if we want to use anonymous function but not necessarily put it straight into the call of the other function, we can cut it all, and what we can do is create the variable function. So we can create the variable, let's say callable function, and now we associate this function with this variable. So what we've created by doing this is the variable function. If we pass this variable now, because it stores this entire anonymous function, this function still doesn't have a name. It's still anonymous. It's still just a closure. The fact that we have a name of the variable is just basically like passing the reference to the anonymous function. So if we save it and preview it in a browser, it all will work fine. But we just used basically this variable function, which is still anonymous. And obviously make sure that when you're doing this way, we need to obviously place semicolon at the end, because we are associating something with the variable. So obviously we need to terminate our statement with a semicolon.